The north wind had already begun to cool the pond. Though it took many weeks of steady blowing to accomplish it, it is so deep. When I began to have a fire at evening, before I plastered my house, the chimney carried smoke particularly well because of the numerous chinks between the boards. Yet I passed some cheerful evenings in that cool and airy apartment, surrounded by the rough brown boards full of knots and rafters with the bark on high overhead. My house never pleased my eye so much after it was plastered, though I was obliged to confess it was more comfortable. Should not every apartment in which man dwells be lofty enough to create some obscurity overhead, where flickering shadows may play at evening about the rafters? These forms are more agreeable to the fancy and imagination than fresco paintings or other of the most expensive furniture. I now first began to inhabit my house, I may say, when I began to use it for warmth as well as shelter. I had got a couple of old fire dogs to keep the wood from the hearth, and it did me good to see the soot form at the back of the chimney which I had built, and I poked the fire with more right and more satisfaction than usual. My dwelling was small, and I could hardly entertain an echo in it, but it seemed larger for being a single apartment and remote from neighbors. All the attractions of the house were concentrated in one room. It was the kitchen, chamber, parlor, and keeping room, and whatever satisfaction parent or child, master or servant derive in living in a house, I enjoyed it all. Cato says the master of a family, paterfamilias, must have in his rustic villa celum orarium, venarium, dolia multa, uti lubiat caritatem, expectare, et re, et verite, et gloria erit. That is, an oil and wine cellar, many casks, so it may be pleasant to expect hard times, for it will be to his advantage and virtue and glory. I had in my cellar a firkin of potatoes, about 2 quarts of peas with the weevil in them, and on my shelf a little rice, a jug of molasses, and of rye and Indian meal, a peck of each. I sometimes dream of a larger and more populous house, standing in a golden age of enduring materials and without gingerbread work, which shall still consist of only one room, a vast, rude, substantial, primitive hall, without ceiling or plastering, with bare rafters and purlins supporting a sort of lower heaven over one's head, useful to keep off rain and snow, where the king and queen posts stand out to receive your homage, when you have done reverence to the prostrate Saturn of an older dynasty on stepping over the sill. A cavernous house wherein you must reach up to a torch upon a pole to see the roof, where some may live in the fireplace, some in the recess out of the window, and some on settles, some at one end of the hall, some at another, and some aloft on the rafters with the spiders, if they choose. A house which you have got into when you have opened the outside door and the ceremony is over, where the weary traveler may wash and eat and converse and sleep without further journey. Such a shelter as you might be glad to reach on a tempestuous night, containing all the essentials of a house and nothing for housekeeping, where you can see all the treasures of the house at one view, and everything hangs upon its peg that a man should use, at once kitchen, pantry, parlor, chamber, storehouse, and garret, where you can see so necessary a thing as a barrel or a ladder, so convenient a thing as a cupboard, and hear the pot boil, and pay your respects to the fire that cooks your dinner, and the oven that bakes your bread, and the necessary furniture and utensils, which are the chief ornaments, where the washing is not put out, nor the fire, nor the mistress, and perhaps you are sometimes requested to move from off the trap door, when the cook would descend into the cellar, and so learn whether the ground is solid or hollow beneath you with stamping. A house whose inside is as open and manifest as a bird's nest, and you can go in at the front door and out at the back without seeing some of its inhabitants, where to be a guest is to be presented with the freedom of the house, and not to be carefully excluded from 7/8 of it, shut up in a particular cell, and told to make yourself at home there, in solitary confinement. Nowadays the host does not admit you to his hearth, but has got the mason to build one for yourself somewhere in his alley, and the hospitality is the art of keeping you at great distance. There's as much secrecy about the cooking as if he had a design to poison you. I am aware that I have been on many a man's premises, and might have been legally ordered off, but I am not aware that I have been in many men's houses. I might visit in my old clothes a king and queen who lived simply in such a house as I have described, if I were going their way. But backing out of a modern palace will be all that I shall desire to learn, if ever I am caught in one. It would seem as if the very language of our parlors would lose all its nerve and degenerate into palaver wholly. Our lives pass at such remoteness from its symbols, and its metaphors and tropes are necessarily so far-fetched through slides and dumbwaiters, as it were. In other words, the parlor is so far from the kitchen and the workshop. The dinner even is only the parable of a dinner commonly, as if only the savage dwelt near enough to nature and truth to borrow a trope from them. How can the scholar who dwells away in the Northwest Territory or the Isle of Man tell what is parliamentary in the kitchen? However, only one or two of my guests were ever bold enough to stay and eat a hasty pudding with me. But when they saw the crisis approaching, they beat a hasty retreat rather, as if it would shake the house to its foundations. Nevertheless, it stood through a great many hasty puddings. I did not plaster till it was freezing weather. I brought over some wider and cleaner sand for the purpose from the opposite shore of the pond in a boat, a sort of conveyance which would have tempted me to go much farther if necessary. My house had in the meanwhile been shingled down to the ground on every side. In laughing, I was pleased to be able to send home each nail with a single blow of the hammer, and it was my ambition to transfer the plaster from the board to the wall neatly and rapidly. I remembered the story of a conceited fellow who, in fine clothes, was wont to lounge about the village once, giving advice to workmen. Venturing one day to substitute deeds for words, he turned up his cuffs, seized a plasterer's board, and having loaded his trowel without mishap, with a complacent look toward the lathing overhead, made a bold gesture thitherward, and straightway, to his complete discomfiture, received the whole contents on his ruffled bosom. I admired anew the economy and convenience of plastering, which so efficiently shuts out the cold and takes a handsome finish, and I learned the various casualties to which a plasterer is liable. I was surprised to see how thirsty the bricks were which drank up all the moisture in my plaster before I had smoothed it, and how many pailfuls of water it takes to christen a new hearth. I had the previous winter made a small quantity of lime by burning the shells of the Unio fluviatilis, which our river affords for the sake of an experiment, so that I knew where my materials came from. I might have got good limestone within a mile or two and burned it myself, if I had cared to do so. The pond had in the meanwhile skimmed over in the shadiest and shallowest coves, some days or even weeks before the general freezing. The first ice is especially interesting and perfect, being hard, dark, and transparent, and affords the best opportunity that ever offers for examining the bottom where it is shallow, for you can lie at your length on ice only an inch thick, like a skater insect on the surface of water, and study the bottom at your leisure, only 2 or 3 inches distant, like the picture behind glass, and the water is necessarily always smooth then. There are many furrows in the sand where some creature has traveled about and doubled on its tracks, and for wrecks it is strewn with the cases of caddis worms made from minute grains of white quartz. Perhaps these have creased it, for you find some of their cases in the furrows, though they are deep and broad for them to make. But the ice itself is the object of most interest, though you must improve the earliest opportunity to study it. If you examine it closely the morning after it freezes, you find that the greater part of the bubbles, which at first appear to be within it, are actually under the surface, and that more are continually rising from the bottom, while the ice is as yet comparatively solid and dark. That is, you see the water through it. These bubbles are from an 80th to an 1/8 of an inch in diameter, very clear and beautiful, and you see your face reflected in them through the ice. There may be 30 or 40 of them to a square inch. There are also already within the ice narrow, oblong, perpendicular bubbles about 1/2 an inch long, sharp cones with the apex upward, or oftener, if the ice is quite fresh, minute spherical bubbles, one directly above another, like a string of pearls. But these within the ice are not so numerous nor obvious as those beneath. I sometimes used to cast on stones to try the strength of the ice, and those which broke through carried in air with them, which formed very large and conspicuous white bubbles beneath. One day, when I came to the same place 48 hours afterward, I found that those large bubbles were still perfect, though an inch more of ice had formed, as I could see distinctly by the seam in the edge of the cake. But as the last 2 days had been very warm, like an Indian summer, the ice was not now transparent, showing the dark green color of the water and the bottom, but opaque and whitish or gray, and though twice as thick, was hardly stronger than before, for the air bubbles had greatly expanded under the heat and run together, and lost their regularity. They were no longer one directly over another, but often like silvery coins poured from a bag, one overlapping another, or in thin flakes, as if occupying slight cleavages. The beauty of the ice was gone, and it was too late to study the bottom. Being curious to know what position my great bubbles occupied with regard to the new ice, I broke out a cake containing a middling-sized one and returned it bottom upward. The new ice had formed around and under the bubble, so that it was included between the two ices. It was wholly in the lower ice, but close against the upper, and was flattish, or perhaps slightly lenticular, with rounded edge, 1/4 of an inch deep by 4 inches in diameter, and I was surprised to find that directly under the bubble the ice was melted with great regularity in the form of a saucer reversed, to the height of 5/8 of an inch in the middle, leaving a thin partition where between the water and the bubble hardly 1/8 of an inch thick. And in many places the small bubbles in this partition had burst downward, and probably there was no ice at all under the larger bubbles, which were 1 foot in diameter. I inferred that the infinite number of minute bubbles which I had first seen against the surface of the ice were now frozen in likewise, and that each, in its degree, had operated like a burning glass on the ice beneath to melt and rot it. These were the little air guns which contribute to make the ice crack and whoop. At length the winter set in good earnest, just as I had finished plastering, and the winds began to howl around the house as if it had not had permission to do so till then. Night after night the geese came lumbering in the dark, with a clangor and a whistling of winds, even after the ground was covered with snow, some to alight in Walden, and some flying low over the woods towards Fairhaven, bound for Mexico. Several times, when returning from the village at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I heard the tread of the flock of geese, or else ducks, on the dried leaves in the woods by the pond hole behind my dwelling, where they had come up to feed, and the faint honk or quack of their leader as they hurried off. In 1845, Walden froze entirely over for the first time on the night of the 22nd of December, Flint's and other shallower ponds, the river having been frozen 10 days or more. In 46, the 16th. In 49, about the 31st, and in 50, around the 27th of December. In 52, the 5th of January. In 53, the 31st of December. The snow had already covered the ground since the 25th of November, and surrounded me suddenly with the scenery of winter. I withdrew yet farther into my shell, and endeavored to keep a bright fire both within my house and within my breast. My employment out of doors now was to collect the dead wood in the forest, bringing it in my hands or on my shoulders, or sometimes trailing a dead pine tree under each arm to my shed. An old forest fence, which had seen its best days, was a great haul for me. I sacrificed it to Vulcan, and it was past serving the god Terminus. How much more interesting an event is that man's supper, who has just been forth in the snow to hunt, nay, you might say, steal, the fuel to cook it with. His bread and meat are sweet. There are enough faggots and wastewood in all kinds of forests of most of our towns and support many fires, but which at present warm none, and some think hinder the growth of young wood. There are also driftwood of the pond, In the course of the summer, I had discovered a raft of pitch pine logs with the bark on, pinned together by the Irish when the railroad was built. This I hauled up partly on the shore. After soaking 2 years and then lying high 6 months, it was perfectly sound, though waterlogged past drying. I amused myself one winter day with sliding this piecemeal across the pond, nearly half a mile, skating behind, with one end of a log 15 feet long on my shoulder and the other on the ice. Or I tied several logs together with a birch with, and then, with a longer birch or alder, which had a hook at the end, dragged them across. Though completely waterlogged and almost as heavy as lead, they not only burned long, but they made a very hot fire. Nay, I thought they burned better for the soaking, as if the pitch, being confined by the water, burned longer, as in a lamp. Gilpin, in his account of the forest borders of England, said that the encroachment of trespassers and the houses and fence thus raised on the border of the forest were considered as great nuisances by the old forest law, and were severely punished under the name perpresturis, ascending ad terrarium ferarum, ag noctunum forestae, etc., to the frightening of the game and the detriment of the forest. But I was interested in the preservation of the venison and the vert more than the hunters or woodchoppers, and as much as though I had been the Lord Warden himself, and if any part was burned, though I burned it myself by accident, I grieved with a grief that lasted longer and was more inconsolable than that of the proprietors. Nay, I grieved when it was cut down by the proprietors themselves. I would that our farmers, when they cut down a forest, felt the same of that awe with which the old Romans did when they came to thin or let in the light to a consecrated grove, lucum conlucare, that is, would believe that it is the sacred to some god. The Roman made an expiatory offering and prayed, "Whatever god or goddess thou art, to whom this grove is sacred, be propitious to me, my family, and children," etc. It is remarkable what a value is still put upon wood, even in this age and in this new country, a value more permanent and universal than that of gold. After all our discoveries and invention, no man will go buy a pile of wood. It is as precious to us as it were to our Saxon and Norman ancestors. If they made their bows of it, we make our gun stocks of it. Micho, more than 30 years ago, says that the price of wood for fuel in New York and Philadelphia nearly equals and sometimes exceeds that of the best wood in Paris, though this immense capital annually requires more than 300,000 cords and is surrounded to the distance of 300 miles of cultivated plains. In this town, the price of wood rises almost steadily, and the only question is, how much higher is it to be this year than it was last? Mechanics and tradesmen who come in person to the forest on no other errand are sure to attend the wood auction, or even pay a high price for the privilege of gleaning after the wood chopper. It is now many years that men have resorted to the forest for fuel and for the material of the arts. The New Englander and the Hollander, the Parisian and the Celt, the farmer and the Robin Hood, Goody Blake and Harry Gill, in most parts of the world, the prince and the peasant, the scholar and the savage, equally require still a few sticks from the forest to warm them and cook their food. Neither could I do without them. Every man looks at his woodpile with a kind of affection. I love to have mine before my window, and the more chips the better to remind me of my pleasing work. I had an old axe which nobody claimed, which by spells and winter days, on the sunny side of the house, I played about the stumps which I had got out of my bean field. As my driver prophesied when I was plowing, they warmed me twice. Once while I was splitting them, and again when they were on fire, so that no fuel could give out more heat. As for the axe, I was advised to get the village blacksmith to jump it. But I jumped him, and putting a hickory helve from the woods into it, made it do. If it was dull, it was at least hung true. A few pieces of fat pine were a great treasure. It is interesting to remember how much of This food is fire. This food for fire is still concealed in the bowels of the earth. In previous years, I had often gone prospecting over some bare hillside where a pitch pine had formerly stood and got out the fat pine roots. They are almost indestructible. Stumps 30 or 40 years old, at least, will still be sound at the core, though the sapwood has all become vegetable mold, as appeared by the scales of thick bark forming a tree ring level with the earth 4 or 5 inches distant from the heart. With axe and shovel you explore this mine and follow the marrowy store, yellow as beef tallow, or if you had struck on a vein of gold deep into the earth. But commonly I kindled my fire with the dry leaves of the forest, which I had stored up in my shed before the snow came. Green hickory finely split makes the wood chopper's kindling when he has camp in the woods. Once in a while I got a little of this. When the villagers were lighting their fires beyond the horizon, I too gave notice of the various wild inhabitants of the Walden Vale by a smoky streamer from my chimney that I was awake. Light winged smoke, a carrion bird, melting thy pinions in thy upward flight, lark without song and messenger of dawn, circling above the hamlets as thy nest, or else departing dream and shadowy form of midnight vision gathering up thy skirts, by night star veiling and by day darkening the light and blotting out the sun. Go thou, my incense, upward from this hearth, and ask the gods to pardon this clear flame. Hard green wood just cut, though I used but little of that, answered my purpose better than any other. I sometimes left a good fire when I went to take a walk in the winter afternoon, and when I returned 3 or 4 hours afterward, it would still be alive and glowing. My house was not empty, though I was gone. It was as if I had left a cheerful housekeeper behind. It was I and fire that lived there, and commonly my housekeeper proved trustworthy. One day, however, as I was splitting wood, I thought that I would just look in the window and see if the house was not on fire. It was the only time I remember to have this particularly anxiety on this score. So I looked and saw that a spark had caught my bed, and I went in and extinguished it when it had burned a place as big as my hand. But my house occupied so sunny and sheltered a position, and its roof was so low, that I could afford to let the fire go out in the middle of almost any winter day. The moles nested in my cellar, nibbling every third potato and making a snug bed even there for some hair left after plastering and of brown paper. For even the wildest animals love comfort and warmth as well as man, and they survive the winter only because they are so careful to secure them. Some of my friends spoke as if I was coming to the woods on purpose to freeze myself. The animal merely makes a bed, which he warms with his body, in a sheltered place. But man, having discovered fire, boxes up some air in a spacious apartment and warms that. Instead of robbing himself, makes that his bed, of which he can move about divested in more cumbrous clothing, maintain a kind of summer in the midst of winter, and by means of window even admit the light, and with a lamp lengthen out the day. Thus he goes a step or two beyond instinct, and saves a little time for the fine arts. Though, when I had been exposed to the rudest blasts a long time, my whole body began to grow torpid. When I reached my genial atmosphere of my house, I soon recovered my faculties and prolonged my life. But the most luxurious house has little to boast of in this respect, nor need we trouble ourselves to speculate how the human race may be at last destroyed. It would be easy to cut their threads any time with a little sharper blast from the north. We go on dating from cold Fridays and great snows, but a little colder Friday or a greater snow would put a period to man's existence on the globe. The next winter, I used a small cooking stove for economy, since I did not own the forest. But it did not keep fire so well as the open fireplace. Cooking was then, for the most part, no longer a poetic, but merely a chemic process. It will soon be forgotten in these days of stoves that we used to roast potatoes in the ashes after the Indian fashion. The stove not only took up room and scented the house, but it concealed the fire, and I felt as if I had lost a companion. You can always see a face in the fire. The laborer, looking into it at evening, purifies his thoughts of the dross and earthiness in which they have accumulated during the day. But I could no longer sit and look into the fire, and the pertinent words of a poet reoccurred to me with new force. Never bright flame may be denied to me, thy dear life imaging close sympathy. What but my hopes shot upward ere so bright? What but my fortunes sunk so low in night? Why art thou banished from our hearth and hall, thou who art welcomed and beloved by all? Why thy existence then too fanciful? For our life's common light, why are so dull? Did thy bright gleam mysterious converse hold with our congenial souls, secrets too bold? Well, we are safe and strong, for now we sit beside a hearth where no dim shadows flit, where nothing cheers nor saddens but a fire, warm feet and hands, nor does to more aspire. By whose compact utilitarian heap the present may sit down and go to sleep, nor fear the ghosts who from the dim past walked, and with us by the unequal light of the old wood fire talked.